When I was a young child, I used to lose my temper so completely, so severely, that I literally do not remember losing my temper. But I am told by friends and relatives that I trust that I did go after people with very bad intent. I have a terrible temper that very few people have ever seen, and this temper was inherited. My father has this terrible temper, and his father had it as well. And while as a young child I wasn't overly mad, I wasn't overly angry, I could be driven into a rage. My father understood this, and he understood that there were consequences for letting that take hold, so he drove it into me, that letting the rage take over could lead me to do things that I would regret. It could lead me to hurt people that didn't deserve to be hurt as badly as I could when I got older and stronger. He taught me to control my temper. And this is a temper that very few women can understand. This is one of many reasons why fathers are important. With the idea of that kind of white-hot rage in mind, I would like you to consider a saying that has been being flung around, and that is, white people are nice until they're not. While I can explain what this phrase means with respect to reality, Devin Stack over at the channel Black Pilled has done such a good job of explaining it that I will just let his words speak for themselves.
So, what made this film so powerful? What was it about Office Space that could account for this phenomenon? Well, it's because it told the truth. It told the truth about corporate America, but also the truth about an aspect of white men that makes many people who write films uncomfortable. You see, Office Space wasn't written by people that typically write films in Hollywood. It was written and directed by Mike Judge, a white male who didn't come from Hollywood or money and had worked in the real world before. He understood white men better than most of Hollywood, and an aspect of their behavior that's relevant today. Lately, I've heard people say the phrase, and I've said it myself, that white men are nice until they're not. Now, to some people, that sounds like maybe a passive-aggressive threat, but it's not. It's descriptive of how many white men process conflict. Some people, when they attempt to describe this behavior, will conjure up the image of a kid getting bullied and bullied and bullied until one day he snaps. They make it seem as if this kid, who obviously is a metaphor for the white man, is like a canister of volatile material that's just getting shaken and shaken until the pressure builds up and it explodes. But this totally misunderstands the process. Office Space walks us through the real steps of what's going on in the minds of white men when faced with conflict. It acknowledges that the extreme reaction to the outside danger isn't something that slowly develops. It's not the product of pressure being applied over time that makes their solution to the conflict more and more extreme as the pressure builds up until they snap. But instead, if you really understand the process, you understand that the initial solution in the minds of these men is extreme. And there is no snap. There is simply a slow erosion of the self-control that's containing that initial instinct to deliver a devastating response. The initial extreme solution is rarely acted upon because it's typically so extreme, so severe that given time to rationally weigh the consequences of carrying it out and assessing the collateral damage, the rational mind often concludes that enduring the problem and tolerating the danger seems safer than executing the extreme solution. From the very start of the conflict, that is the equation. These men will table what seems like an extreme solution to a problem in the hopes that the problem will resolve itself, or that a less extreme solution presents itself later, and they'll delay until the stress generated by the conflict or the problem or the perceived danger outweighs the perceived or predicted collateral damage that might come with being assertive and taking the extreme action that they have in mind.
What Devin Stack described there was actually a survival trait Especially during less civilized times than we live through now, if you're faced with potential confrontation, your mind is going to go to the most drastic solution possible because that might be what you need to survive. However, the frequency of actually needing to take that drastic action is fairly low. It's just that if you need to take it once and you don't, you're dead. The other side of that is taking those drastic actions when you don't need to has consequences. You can get thrown in prison, you can start a feud that goes on for years like the Hatfields and McCoys, or you can even feel guilty for your actions. Even not taking the most drastic action that you can think of, you can get into a fight with somebody who maybe deserves a fat lip and a shot to the solar plexus and go overboard. You can give him a fractured skull, 3 broken ribs, and a collapsed lung when he just needed a fat lip. My father understood this, and that's why he taught me to control my temper, to control my rage. And in fact, since elementary school, there's only been a handful of times where I've even been pushed close to losing my temper, and except for one particular time, every single time I got pushed close to it, I was able to rein myself back in. I do have control over my temper, and that one time I was letting myself lose my temper. Several years ago, I was driving through Albuquerque, New Mexico at night, and all of a sudden there was a very loud noise and a concussion that went through the cab of my truck. Clueless as to what had actually happened because it had never happened to me before, I was looking around for a large explosion. I thought a stick of dynamite might have gone off or something, but it turns out that it wasn't quite that drastic. Eventually I pulled over and got out to look for damage, and what I noticed that was there then and hadn't been there when I'd gotten into the truck was a little furrow down my driver's side door, probably about a half-inch wide and maybe 3 or 4 inches long. The only rational explanation for this little furrow was that a bullet had ricocheted off my driver's side door while I was driving down the road in the middle of town. Looking at the angle of the furrow, it's clear that I wasn't actually the intended target of this bullet. It was going downwards at 20 or 30 degrees. It was probably some jackass gangbanger trying to intimidate a rival and shooting his gun into the air at 3/4 of a mile up the road. Nevertheless, had it been 12 or 18 inches further to my right as I was driving down the road, there's a chance that it could have ricocheted off of my hood and right into my face. When the realization that something like that has just happened to you, it tends to change your immediate and short-term perspective, and it also tends to put you into a foul mood, or at least it does me. Either way, there was no way I could know who had done it, and there's really no reasonable way that whoever had done it would get caught. So eventually I continued on my way home. As I got closer to home, I was in a better neighborhood, and at one point there was a red 2-door Jeep Wrangler in the left lane. It was going slow, so I went to pass it, no big deal. As I got up next to it, there were 3 white males who were looking for trouble in the Jeep, and they started yelling and screaming and trash-talking. I'd speed up, they'd speed up. I'd slow down, they'd slow down. They were right next to me, and yes, I did do exactly what Devin Stack had said that many white males do. My mind immediately went to the most drastic form of action I could take right then and there, and then I shelved that idea. I didn't want to go to prison for 40 years for shooting all 3 of them with a .357 Magnum. And even though it was 3 guys who were trying to pick a fight with one guy, they were in their late teens or early 20s and didn't deserve to be murdered for doing what they were doing. And besides, I could tell from their general build that I was bigger and stronger than all 3 of them. After a certain amount of time had passed, I had eventually slowed down to around 10 or 15 miles an hour, and at that point I decided that I was going to fight these 3 individuals right then and right there. I was going to let my temper go. That earlier incident of having the bullet ricochet off of my door had put me in a certain mindset to where this seemed perfectly acceptable, and besides, they were trying to pick the fight with me. Being an adult at this time, unlike when I was a child, I actually do remember the process of beginning to lose my temper. And it is this process that is the important part of this story, not what actually happened. And I say that because when I reflected on what had happened after it had happened, what shocked me was the mental clarity with which I was able to plan how to take on these 3 individuals as a white-hot rage was building up inside. And make no mistake, I wasn't going after them to kick their asses out of self-defense. I wasn't going to throw the first punch for reasons of self-defense. I wanted to hurt them. My empathy had completely shut down. but I still had the fact that there were 3 of them and only 1 of me to contend with, so I needed to deal with that, and I wasn't going to be fair in any way, shape, or form. Fighting them right then and there was part of a strategy to deal with that. So I flung my transmission into neutral and ripped off my seatbelt and was yelling about how I was going to kick all 3 of their asses, and then I crammed on the emergency brake. Of course, the rear tires locked up, and the truck started coming to a screeching halt, and I flung open the door and had my legs swung out of the truck before I'd come to a complete stop. You see, this was part of the plan to deal with 3-on-1. The guy in the back seat of the Jeep was going to have to crawl through the front seat to get out, and the driver was going to have to get out and come around the Jeep to deal with me. That left the passenger, and I needed to get the jump on him so that he couldn't get out and so that the guy in the back seat couldn't get out through the passenger seat. The plan was to be the first one out so that when the passenger flung open the door, I could kick it back shut and knock the ever-living shit out of him through the window. I was going to methodically deal with these 3 individuals one at a time. That was cold, mechanical thinking that was happening on top of white-hot rage growing. And I found that cold, mechanical thinking to be shocking later when I reflected on the event. But as I flung my door open and swung my legs out, the eyes of the 3 individuals in the Jeep got huge. They didn't expect me to do that. And I must have had a murderous look on my face because the Jeep started accelerating away from me, including running red lights. They did try to throw a beer bottle at me, but didn't even come close. This is probably a good thing because I was about to be in a 3-on-1 fight, which is a good way to get your ass kicked, but had my plan worked, and had I gotten the upper hand on these guys, I probably would have beaten them very severely, more severely than they would have in fact deserved. And that was the only time in my adult life that I let myself lose my temper, and make no mistake, I did let myself. I have been in other fights where I did not let my temper get the best of me, which is why I think the mental process of losing it is the important part of the story, not the actual results. It is a process where your empathy completely shuts down. A rage hot enough to burn the sun from the sky begins growing, and that starts fueling cold, mechanical thinking. Now just imagine this process when the most drastic course of action is still on the table. In fact, imagine this process on a much larger and much more collective scale. Because given the current political divide in this country, and given that there is a really good chance that the losing side will not accept the results of the 2020 election, and given the almost certainty that there is going to be another economic event that's worse than the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008, I think there is a very good chance that you will see us collectively lose our tempers. Do not mistake restraint for weakness.